Thank you. It's really my great honor and privilege to be here today and to introduce the keynote speaker. But first, I want to thank our hosts, the Bank of Thailand, for really putting together a great conference in a fantastic facility. It's really a great pleasure to be for all of us to be here in Bangkok today and tomorrow. So thank you for hosting us. So let me introduce Şebnem. I mean, it's not like Şebnem needs a long introduction. Everyone knows her, but let me say a few words. Şebnem is the Schreiber Family Professor of Economics at Brown University. She's one of the leading scholars in international macroeconomics and finance, a director of Brown's Global Linkages Lab, co-editor of American Economic Journal Macroeconomics, and before that has been also involved with many other journals. In addition to this, Şebnem serves on the advisory panel of the New York Federal Reserve, the Bank for International Settlements, and of course at the fund, we very fondly remember that she, in a few years back, was a senior policy advisor in the research department when Gita Gopinath was the economic counselor. Now, on the research side, Şebnem's work has helped define how economists think about the real effects of global financial integration, which is certainly a topic that is first order for policymakers. She has done work on the well-known Lucas paradox, why capital doesn't flow from north to south, with Laura, who is also here today. She has done more recently work on global spillovers from Fed tightening, dollar risks and emerging market balance sheets, or how tariff uncertainty and fragmentation reshape exchange rates, inflation, and trade networks. And over the last few years, Şebnem has also invested deeply in building models that include very rich input-output linkages to understand the propagation of shocks, whether we're looking at monetary policy, whether we're looking at trade policy, we're looking at geoeconomic fragmentation, oil price shocks. And I think that's absolutely first order when we want to think about the complex world in which we live. This is something that actually Şebnem and I had started working on and at the sort of embryonic stage during the COVID crisis, where we wanted to understand what would be the impact of fiscal support measures that were implemented at that time on economic activity more broadly, and helping firms and households survive the COVID crisis. But it's part of a broader agenda. We need to understand shocks. The world we live in is a world in which we have very large but also very concentrated shocks, concentrated sectorally, concentrated geographically. And if we want to understand how they propagate within countries, across countries, within sectors, across sectors, we need that kind of granularity. We've put in a lot of work at the fund in building models, large-scale models that would capture some of that granularity so that we can have very differentiated advice for countries. And also in thinking about the kind of data that is needed to discipline these richer models, because if you have larger models, they have more parameters, they have more degrees of freedom, and you need to discipline them. You need more data to go with that. So we're certainly big fans of Şebnem's research agenda, broadly speaking, and I think it's perfectly fitting that she will be delivering the keynote today here on interdependencies in a geopolitically fragmented world. It speaks directly to the theme of our conference. So with this, let me welcome Şebnem to the stage. Thank you very much, Şebnem, for joining us for this. I understand that it was not an easy journey to get here, but you made the time. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Pierre-Olivier, for that great introduction. And I also would like to start by thanking IMF, Bank of Thailand, for inviting me to give this keynote in this amazing location at this fantastic conference. Let me start by repeating the title, I would like to talk about economic policies for a globally interdependent and geopolitically fragmented world. Let me see. Yes. The conference is about changing global order. So I would like to start at that, exactly how that global order is changing. Global order is in transition towards what I call globalization 2.0. Globalization 2.0 is not going to be deglobalization, but it's going to be different than the globalization we know of, going back to before 2020, before the pandemic. So what do we know so far? Let's start with trade fragmentation. With trade fragmentation, we know that at least when we look at bilateral trade between US-China, that has fallen from something like above 20% of US GDP, maybe less than 10%. But the global trade, nothing is happening to global trade. It might be even increasing. There's a relocation story. So IMF put it out in 2023. Laura has her influential Jackson Hole paper in 2023. Pierre-Olivier has worked with Gita and others also at the fund, 2024, and then Richard Baldwin this year. So there's definitely a relocation story going on. We are not sure how it is that shaping. It started maybe countries aligning along the geopolitical lines, friendly countries trading with each other. Maybe now it is more of a rerouting, transshipment story, or maybe all of them going at the same time. We are, these references here are the pioneers here on this, and we are still experiences. We are living this through. Of course, at the same time, we are seeing frequent trade disruptions because of the economic statecraft in this new age of great power competition. So even this great power competition started as a technological rivalry between US and China. Now, of course, it is global. Now we are talking about more hegemons, middle powers, superpower of middle powers, like thinking of countries like Canada or Japan or European Union. And if you ask me, is there another episode like this? I would say before First World War, we had actually a very similar episode. So we yet to see what will happen on the trade side. On the financial side, again, there has been evidence in the aggregate data, looking at FDI data, bilateral portfolio flows. Again, IMF's work in 2023, Laura's work, and others culminating in the Geneva report in 2025, shows us that there seems to be some pattern shaping in capital flows along the geopolitical lines, more investment among the friendly countries. When you look at the financial markets, of course, they are booming, right? You don't call it fragmentation. There's like record global capital flows. A big part of that, of course, is the financing of the AI and tech boom, which gives the central role to US equity markets. And when you talk to these people, when you go and talk to traders at Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, on the FX side, on the bond side, they tell you, this is the best time ever for financial markets. Yes, there's geopolitics, but they know how to deal with geopolitics. They actually see geopolitics as another macro shock, and they tell you that they can price that in. Okay. Now, how to think about this transition? So how do we, given what we know about the trade fragmentation and financial fragmentation, what happened in the last few years, this is still happening, right? We are living this through. How to think about this transition from globalization 1 to globalization 2? I would like to think about this transition in global networks. So let me, quote here from a 16th century poet, John Donne, who said, "No man is an island, entire of itself. Everyone is a piece of the continent, a part of the main. Any man's death diminishes me because I'm involved in mankind." There's the rest of this quote. I'm going to bring it up again in conclusion. But this is about connectivity, right? This is about global interdependence. So this says we shouldn't be, if we are thinking in terms of networks, we shouldn't just think about the nodes. Nodes are economies, countries. But we should also think about the edges. We should also think about the linkages because shocks are going to travel there. So that tells us, for a central banking perspective, for a macroeconomic perspective, macroeconomics of an integrated world cannot be done one country at a time or one sector at a time, or even one firm at a time or groups of firms at a time, right? We have to we have to be looking at in an integrated sense. So what we were involved, as Pierre-Olivier mentioned in his introduction, to develop a new framework, a multi-country, multi-sector general equilibrium model. It is a smaller scale than what the fund is developing. Our idea is to bring all the international input-output linkages. We are building on the domestic economy models of Bakay and Fahri, and we extend them to open economy with endogenous exchange rate, current accounts, dynamics, and monetary policy. Okay. Why do we think this is useful? This new global networks framework is useful. First and foremost, this is going to allow us to bring both the production side and the trade side and the financial side. So we will be looking at these multi-layer networks, production networks, financial networks, and the trade networks. And here is a very aggregate depiction of this. You see that, Thailand is going to be in the rest of the world there. I'm showing US, Mexico, Canada, European Union, and China, because those are the countries that are at the forefront of the tariff episode. But the point here is really to also see these linkages, these many lines behind that is going to capture all sorts of things, right? Financial, trade, and production. So you can then start thinking when there's a domestic shock in the United States, that shock can be natural disasters, monetary policy, fiscal policy, sector-specific technology shock. That shock can also happen in China, which would be a foreign shock to the US, but a domestic shock to China, but they are going to travel differently across these networks. And then there's also international shocks or global shocks that can hit everyone, like wars, like the whole Iran war and Hormuz issue that we are going through right now, geopolitical shocks, and other trade wars, and also financial crises. They can also be affecting many linkages at the same time. But we think this is going to be a useful framework to think about these issues, especially when we want to understand the use of geopolitical tools in a highly globally interdependent world, right? So geopolitics may not be new, it goes back obviously a century back, but maybe the use of it in such a tightly integrated world might be the new thing here, right? So what does it mean? First of all, the global interdependence itself is going to give us resilience. So this is not artifact of the good policy making or good luck, but a structural feature of the system. The system is so integrated in terms of trade, production, and finance that it is going to give you resilience. And I will explain this later on. Second, again, when you use these geopolitical tools in this highly interdependent world, every action is going to have an unintended consequence, macroeconomic consequence, even for the large players. Even your US and China having some sort of market power, your actions are going to be self-defeating. Of course, you can be starting from a point of, look, I want to hurt the other countries, so I'm going to take some damage to myself. But what we are going to show is actually the damage you are calculating on yourself is much lower than what the true damage can be in a globally interdependent world. Who gains and who loses in this world when these geopolitical tools used is going to be a global general outcome. It's not going to depend on any country's particular power. And measurement of these things is going to be extremely hard because measurement has to be done at the firm level. And there you are going to have a misalignment of incentives because firms are going to care about profits, growth. They might also care about things like supply chain resilience, but that has to meet with this rivalry, this power rivalry between states, and that's going to give you a lot of misaligned incentives that is going to lead to misallocation of global capital. So this is all going to say at the end, when we talk about economic leverage, maybe it is not necessarily about choke points like Hormuz. If you think about it, Hormuz was always there, but it became a choke point after the war started, right? Or it may not be about market power like rare earths, but it is going to come from the global general equilibrium response of many heterogeneous agents acting in their self-interest in the global marketplace. Okay, and for a macroeconomist, this is going to mean that if you use models without full global I/O linkages, then you might overestimate the level of the inflation, but you are definitely going to underestimate the persistence of inflation. And also you may underestimate some real costs in terms of output and jobs. And that's what the central banker is going to care about at the end. So let me start with trade policy. So in the remaining of my time, I'm going to go to three policies try to make these points clear without showing equations: trade policy, monetary policy, and fiscal policy. Start with trade policy. So this is a figure from Council of Foreign Relations. You can see since 2020, there is this increased use of protectionist tools. So this figure is titled as the rise of economic security tools, because it is a figure done by Council of Foreign Relations. So they call it economic security tools because they put national security at the forefront. You know, some papers might call them economic leverage tools, coercion tools. No matter what you call them, they are protectionist tools, and they are going to shape global outcomes. And you can see the red colors are going to be industrial policy, pink are going to be tariffs, import restrictions, and all shades of greens are going to be export restrictions, FDI restrictions, and investment restrictions. Okay. When you think about the use of these type of tools, so geopolitics and trade, there has always been two foundational views on this. This was always the case. This goes back to 1940s. In terms of hegemons, trade, and international monetary system. The stabilizer view is associated with Kindleberger, and that view says a stable world economy is going to require a dominant power, such as the United Kingdom or United States, to supply an open market, counter-cyclical lending, stable exchange rates, and be the lender of last resorts. And we know that this role has been played by United States since the Second World War. Now, the weaponizer view associated with Hirschman really focuses on the asymmetric trade relationship, rightly so, because asymmetric trade relationship is going to generate leverage and influence the supply effects differently than most of our models that assume symmetric trade and balanced trade. And these things, these asymmetric effects is going to give larger, less dependent countries coercive leverage over the other ones. So this is still true, except in the global interdependent world we are living in, maybe nobody is less dependent. So everybody has a chokehold on everybody, and it's going to be a lot about the endogenous responses. Although asymmetry is still going to be very important. In fact, our work is going to show exactly this. Our work is going to show that the trade and financial network can give you macro stabilization and weaponization at the same time for each country, regardless you are small or big, or you are a hegemon country or not. Of course, there's going to be always some unintended consequences, especially when you start looking at firm-level outcomes. Okay, let's start with, as I said, trade policy, focusing on the 2025-2026 tariff episode. This is a figure I'm sure you've seen many times. On the left, I'm showing you what happened in 2025. US tariffs starting at 2% in January 2025, going over 23% by March 2025, and coming back to around 11% March 2026, March of this year. Maybe what is more important is the figure on the right. The colorful figure is the country sector heterogeneity of these unilateral tariffs imposed by United States. You can see the color red, color purple, color orange. These are going to be tariffs not only on China, but also in European Union, Canada, Mexico, and others on not just basic manufacturing, but advanced manufacturing, energy, minerals, agricultural products, and so forth. So there's a lot of heterogeneity, and this huge span of country sector heterogeneity in terms of the tariff episode in 2025-2026. So how do we think about that? So what do we know from textbook way of thinking about tariffs? How do we teach this our students? This is from Krugman, Opsfeld, Mellitz. There is a new paper by Ralph Ossa and Steve Redding in 2026, exactly starting with this graph. When you want to understand large country tariffs, a large country like United States, who wants to manipulate terms of trade, you start at autarky, then you open up the trade, that there is a lower world price, that is a good thing. You demand more than what is supplied in your country, so you import. So consumers are better off, country is better off, of course supplier is going to lose. Then the large country doesn't like this, so the large country puts a tariff, so now the home price is higher. There's going to be some efficiency loss. Those are the purple triangles, and there is going to be a gain from that difference, higher home price, and then the lower foreign price, that's the tariff revenue. And this is the basis to optimal tariff idea, right? So if you somehow can offset that inefficiency with the revenue you gain from tariff, you gain, right? You manipulate the terms of trade, and that number is your optimal tariff. So it is very one-shot, static, permanent tariff. This is what happens type of thinking, which is great. Of course, this is being taught over generations and still being taught. Now, we start exactly at this point and ask ourselves, okay, let's keep this for a long run equilibrium, but let's ask ourselves what is missing from this picture in terms of short and medium run macro. What is missing from a macro perspective from this picture is, of course, the endogenous response of central banks and endogenous response of financial markets to tariff-induced cost and price increases. And if you want to understand this response, writing down a small open economy model versus global general equilibrium, complete financial markets versus incomplete financial markets, and heterogeneous firm responses versus representative firms is going to make a difference. And it is critical in terms of going all the way to global general equilibrium and incomplete financial markets in identifying the aggregate macro impact for your own country, even you are the tariff putting country, even you are the United States, and also global macro impact. Okay, so that's the framework we write. So this is a new open economy macro framework. Without showing many equations, let me tell you the structure. It is very important to bring the very detailed production structure here. So this goes back to the first paper of the conference, like how production kind of follows the demand. So to understand that, especially in short run and medium run in a dynamic model, you bring this production structure where this bottom box, think that like, the cars sector in Thailand, it is going to use, sector-specific labor and intermediate inputs. There can also be capital. Intermediate input is going to bring you the supply chain capital, and then, production networks. If you bring the capital there, that's going to give you the financial networks. The important thing here is that intermediate bundle is going to come from many sectors. To produce a car, you need plastic, chips, steel, and glass, and all that, and that can come from many countries. Now here, there's going to be several layers of substitution and complementarity. Obviously, things like labor and intermediate input, steel and plastic, those things are going to be complements. But once you start, going to the top level and ask, okay, what if, I import steel from Brazil instead of China, or I get the rare earth from Australia instead of China, then you are talking about substitution, and that is really the basis of the resilience we are talking about here. So, resilience is going to build on that. I mean, remember the days when Germany built the LNG platforms in 15 months when they cut off from Russian gas, and everybody was predicting this is going to take at least 5 years. In 15 months, they built this, and they start exporting from the United States instead of Russia. So that's exactly that type of elasticity substitution we are talking about. Okay. On the consumption side, you are going to, again, have the much simpler aggregation, Cobb-Douglas aggregator through different sector bundles. Here, we are going to allow, again, to have different consumer preferences over Japanese cars and German cars, but then we respect the data. The model is going to be disciplined by the data in terms of IO linkages, expenditure shares, and also trade imbalances in the data. This is going to be a model with unbalanced trade. And once we bring the incomplete financial markets, then we can also talk about realistic current account deficits and global imbalance. All right. So this is an N-country J-sector global new Keynesian open economy model. We are going to put trade distortions in the model. Just very quickly, the structure is going to be one when you put the tariff or sanctions, anything that is going to distort the trade, you are going to have a demand shock, a supply shock, and a wealth transfer shock. So demand shock, of course, going to work both on the relative demand side through these consumption shares, the gamma matrix, but also distorting the labor supply. Then you are going to have the supply side coming through omegas. These are the inputs into the production coming from foreign countries, costlier inputs. Here you start racing between terms of trade gains versus the higher marginal cost. Then you are going to have this important elasticity of substitution. That's going to be a vector theta. That's going to be different for every layer, every good. As I told you, you can have, high substitution for Japanese cars and German cars, but low for chips and labor to produce semiconductors. So that's going to give you complements and bottlenecks. Then firms, it is a new Keynesian model, so there's going to be stickiness, discipline with producer currency pricing and dollar currency pricing using empirical estimates coming from Pierre Olivier's work. That is going to, of course, feed directly into how flat or how steep to the Phillips curve. Then, there's the policy response. So all prices and quantities adjust in global general equilibrium when you distort trade. And of course, policy react to that. That's going to have all central banks in it in this phi matrix. And then, of course, that's going to have an extra dimension of contracting aggregate demand. And of course, I cannot move. I don't know why. And the next slide is going to show you expectations. Oh, yes, it's here. Expectation is going to be important because of the intertemporal trade-off, right? Tariffs is going to give you this, should I consume today or tomorrow type of thing, which adds to the entire price and quantity adjustment at a global level. Okay, so I'm not going to show you the solutions and everything. Should I be pointing? Basically, there's going to be two key analytical objects out of this when you solve the model. There's going to be a 5-equation global New Keynesian representation. And those two objects is going to be, one is going to be what we call a risk-sharing wage. That risk-sharing wage under incomplete financial markets is going to be informative about wealth transfers. And the second object is going to be what we call New Keynesian open economy propagation matrix. So the first object is this risk-sharing wage, deviation from complete financial markets, opens up with tariffs. It is going to tell you if the US is losing or gaining, if China is losing or gaining, even with unilateral tariffs. And the sign of this risk-sharing wage is going to depend on, of course, trade elasticity, of course, on shock persistence, but also trade and financial networks. That's the new result. And the second analytical object is this New Keynesian open economy propagation matrix, where the matrix is zero when you only have one sector, one intermediate input sector, and that's the importance of bringing full input-output linkages. The matrix is not zero when you have all the sectors. That's going to give you the persistence. That's going to give you the different results, that tariff is not just a one-time jump in the price level, but because it's going to create real marginal cost distortions in the system, there's going to be inflation persistent, and the more sector you have, more linkages you have, and what you are tariffing goes into more linkage sectors like energy versus chips. And of course, more or less sticky energy is a flexible input. Chips might be, more sticky input. That's going to change this persistence. And finally, the open economy heterogeneity in terms of what the central bank does and how the exchange rate adjusts is going to amplify this propagation. This is going to tell us two new things. First of all, inflation output trade-off domestically is going to depend on these two objects, the risk-sharing wage and the New Keynesian open economy propagation matrix, and stabilization is taking longer. Even you do the optimal monetary policy, still there is going to be persistence in the system. And that, of course, affects the evolution of the global trade flows and the supply chain reshoring. So let me show you some results on that. This is, again, let's just focus on the US right now. US implemented tariffs. These are implemented tariffs in the solid line as of March 2026. You see in the first figure, US inflation goes up 0.4 percentage point, not big because the implemented tariffs end up being small. The output drops in the second figure, real GDP and consumption drops. That is consistent with, of course, the trade models. But look at the persistence. So inflation comes back only after 16 quarters. Now, the dotted line is the threat. So the dotted line is you announce today that you are going to put 25% tariff on China. Tomorrow, you take off that threat. Interestingly, inflation impact is very similar. So one period inflation impact goes up and then comes down, and then consumption, again, just drops for one period and then goes back up. Output goes up here because there is a depreciation because of the expectations of retaliation. Because it's a threat, you expect retaliation as a result of a threat, and that leads to dollar depreciation. Without that, of course, dollar is going to appreciate in this model. Let me go back to these 2 points I made. The dynamics of inflation output trade-off, depending on the networks, and also the shaping of the global trade flows and the supply chains, depending on network. So this is, again, US inflation and US output, and I'm going to show you 3 policy regimes here. One is look-through policy in orange. The other one is perfect CPI stabilization in blue. You see that inflation is 0. And the other one is perfect employment stabilization in green. You see that output doesn't deviate. Now, what is shown here is deviation from the steady state under each policy, and the difference between the solid line and the dotted line is if you have a network or not. So the dotted line is if it is a small open economy or there is just one sector, two economy where the solid line is where there is the full network. You see that whatever deviation you have under what policy, it's going to take longer to clean that up from the system and to come back to the steady state. So even we only look at the positive implications and don't do optimal policy in this paper, normative implication is that even a one-time tariff shock is going to lead to persistent inflation because of these real marginal cost distortions. So stabilization burden is going to be larger under granular networks regardless of the policy rule. That's on the domestic inflation output trade-off dynamics. In terms of global trade and production network and supply chain evolution, you start with the network before 2025, but you see, again, a highly aggregated form of the global network as of 2025, and this data is from 2022, because this is OECD data. It comes with a 3-year lag. But whatever change after the pandemic and after Russia invasion of Ukraine, in terms of making supply chains more resilient, is already here. So thicker arrows shows a more intense trade relationship and production relationship in terms of intermediate goods trade and finance good trades. Then we put the March 2026 tariffs in the system and say, okay, what happens 12 quarters after, by 2029? So every arrow that becomes thicker red is an intensifying relationship, and thinner is a weakening relationship. Just looking at the figure very quickly, you see a story of US being isolated, right? All the arrows of the US is becoming thin, whereas Euro area, China, Canada, Mexico, they start trading more. This is a story of trade diversion. Of course, this is something that comes out of the model. So you would ask yourself, what is happening in real life, in real data? That requires firm level data. And the thing with firm level data, of course, you have to wait. So far we have everything up until 2025. We don't have the 2026 data yet, so I will not be able to tell you the full impact of tariffs. But basically, up to 2025, the evolution of supply chains are actually very, very interesting. So this is actual firm level data match on 4 dimensions. So the shipping data, supply chain data, financing data, FDI data, and portfolio data. And we back it with interviews we did with the CEOs and CFOs of the large US manufacturers and also supply chain managers. So here I'm showing you 5 top supplier of a large US manufacturer. So think this as GM or Tesla, or you can think any sector because we did all the sectors. But basically the story is this. If you just look at the shipments at the firm level and the trade-based supply chain, that's what we call trade-based supply chain, that's the blue, you see that Mexico is going to win the day, right? Most of the inputs is going to come from Mexico. Then you ask, okay, who is the biggest investor into these supply chains? That's the orange line, and you see that highest bar is going to be China. So even you are shipping from the Mexico, China is investing into those firms that you are shipping from as a US manufacturer. And then finally, when you go to the innovation-based supply chain, if you ask, okay, under what pattern and what type of intangible capital these firms operating, you come back, US having the lion's share, the highest bar being green, US meaning the firms you are shipping from as a US manufacturer might have investors from China, but then they are using the technology developed in the United States. So this is tariffs. The sanctions can be different, maybe, and with sanctions we have more data. This is from the paper I have with Dyson and Junhoo, looking at the sanctions, European sanctions on Russia. And by looking at the firm size as of 2021, we find that all firms, regardless of their exporters or non-exporters, are actually hurting from Russian sanctions if they are larger firms. And that's not good news. This is one of the unintended consequences I talked about at the beginning. When you look at the output response by firm size and export response by firm size, again, these are now European firms, you see that top firms, top 1% firms and top 0.1% firms, which are the most productive firms that are going to lead the innovation and growth effort in Europe, they hurt a lot from these Russian sanctions. So there can be differences definitely between tariffs and sanctions. Okay, this is trade. Let's move on to monetary policy. Now, monetary policy is, of course, when you start thinking about monetary policy, automatically you also think about exchange rates. Exchanges and monetary policy in a global interdependent world, how should we think about this if global interdependence now being weaponized? Should we change our thinking. Should monetary policy making be different? This is going to depend on three things. First, how trade relationships and portfolios are shaping in this geopolitically fragmented world. Second, what are the implications for currencies and exchange rates? So we are still living through these changes, so we don't know fully the answer, but of course there are going to be implications on exchange rate of these changes. And third, what are the, of course, implications for international transmission of shocks? Now we think about international transmission, of course we know a lot in this literature, right? We know a lot about monetary policy transmission internationally. We know that US monetary policy has a large global footprint. Federal Reserve is truly the lender of last resort. And I just told you that geopolitically fragmented world means we have more supply shocks, we have more sectoral supply shocks, more imbalances between demand and supply. In that world, we are going to have persistent upward pressure on price and downward pressure on growth. That's a difficult world for central bankers to navigate. So what our work is showing that there's going to be a third dimension in this new world where cross-country differences in monetary policy making is going to be important in pricing the risk premia under this new globalization 2.0 system. So how is that going to work? Let's start with what we know. So we know that if we look at all the US monetary policy shocks, so this is all the US monetary policy tightenings, separated the impact on emerging markets on the left and advanced economies on the right, and this is government bond spreads. We know that they diverge. When US tightens, when Federal Reserve tightens, risk premia increase in emerging markets, bond spreads go up vis-a-vis the US treasuries. In advanced economies, it goes down. If we focus on the latest tightening, as you know, latest tightening is 2022. Fed started tightening in the first quarter of 2022. And now look at exchange rates. This is exchange rates. And separate advanced economies and emerging markets. Advanced economies in blue, emerging markets in red. Both are depreciated vis-a-vis the dollar, the first figure. The second figure now separates countries not by advanced economy and emerging market, but by high monetary policy credibility, low monetary policy credibility, based on actually this very amazing data set by IMF, taking a narrative approach and looking at several layers of monetary policy. So based on that, you see that countries with low monetary policy credibility and weaker frameworks, their currencies depreciated more vis-a-vis the dollar. Now add to that the new finding coming from our network-based framework that will tell you the macro impact of geopolitics is also going to depend on central banks' heterogeneous responses. Remember that 5 matrix I showed you. All countries' monetary policy are in that matrix, which means, again, if we only look at US inflation output, the country that puts unilateral tariffs, and then say, okay, if all the countries follow a Taylor rule, then fine, then there's no inflation in the US. But then if countries start diverging, say China is fixing the exchange rate, EU follows the real rate rule, then even US follows a Taylor rule, there's going to be US inflation, persistent up to 10 quarters, and also US output can be, quite low when EU follows a different policy. Why? Because EU, of course, can divert a lot of trade to themselves by following a real rate rule. Let me finish with fiscal policy, but to talk about fiscal policy, which will go back to this work I did with Pierre-Olivier, I would like to put it in the context of international transmission and think about choke points and shortages. Okay, let's go back to pandemic. When pandemic started, well, actually, it started 2020, but in 2021, when the vaccines started, applied and all, and then when we start seeing the supply chain issues, early on, Reuters made this news that Taiwan sought Germany's help in securing COVID vaccines after Berlin asked for Ireland's help in easing a shortage of semiconductor chips for Germany's auto sector. So it's a very interesting piece of news swapping two vital shortages, right? Shortages of vaccines, shortages of chips. By the end of that year, by December 2021, now we have shortages everywhere, leading to highest levels of global inflation in 4 decades. There has been a lot of debate how policy missed this and everything, but in fact, what is really underestimated is not if inflation transitory or permanent, but the persistent in supply chains disruptions is being missed, and that linked to the inflation. Well, few exceptions, some academics, our work, and also a large shipping company, Maersk. I'm going to show you now some news items. Going back to Reuters News at the beginning of the year, January, so this is like talking about two shortages, chips and vaccines. Then people are still sick, low on workers, still January, February. Now the chip shortage starts, February now, demand start improving because of the vaccines. We move on, late 2021, supply chains are still a mess. So this is the thing that is underestimated, but trade was booming. Our paper for ECB Sintra meetings actually explain why that is the case. Then supply chain disruptions start holding back the recovery. We come to November, that is still the problem. We come to December, that is still the problem. And it seems like these supply chain disruptions persisting and inflation now took on, and the entire 2021 is known as the inflation that central banks miss. 2022, China put extra lockdowns. Now it is clear that this is linked to global inflation and also not finding certain goods. Come to 2026, this is my point about Maersk. Maersk made this point in 2021, combining Suez crisis and the supply chain disruptions, that this is going to push up prices and there is going to be long-lasting inflation. Now they are saying the same thing for Hormuz. If you read this news, they are talking about the persistence, and it is going to take a long time for these cost distortions to clear from the system as we model. How do we see this? Okay, in our framework, you can just think this as a standard CPI equation where you are going to have the standard impact of the productivity shock. So the third energy is going to go through the third term, but any factor, any shortages linked to factors like chips and stuff is going to go through that fourth term, and then there's going to be this local global demand supply imbalance, little bit like, you know, I demand this thing, but certain countries supply that thing, and that's under some sort of chokehold. That is a structural feature of the system. That is before you distort the system with any geopolitical tools and tariffs and all that. If you do that under geopolitical fragmentation, it's going to get worse because you are going to have this additional inflationary impact coming from trade costs. And this framework was quite successful, actually, matching the 2021 inflation, both in US and Europe. The model comes from the diamonds, and the actual inflation is the solid line. And we applied also to the US. We said, okay, let's assume US is going to be vaccinated fast and everybody is going to vaccinate slow. What happens to the US? Well, you know, US kind of loses very little, 0.1% of the output. If there's more complementarity, it goes to 0.3% of the output. So not big a deal. If you only vaccinate US now, it is very interesting, right? US is doing much worse, which is interesting because US is known as a closed economy, right? I mean, it's kind of low on trade share. So now US has lost almost 1% of output under substitution. If you go to a complementarity case, it is still 1%. So it is not really that much about trade shares or complementarity and substitution. They are important, but it is also about these linkages between countries, right? Because when you only vaccinate the US hurts most from that scenario. Why? Because what is happening when you have this multi-layer network view, there's going to be these hidden dependencies revealed when the policies interact with network propagation, given the trade elasticity and trade shares, which are themselves going to endogenously adjust as a result of these policies. Okay, finally, fiscal policy, and I conclude. So this goes back to the work I did with Pierre-Olivier. We started thinking about COVID. There is a demand shock and a supply shock. So supply chain disruptions happening. Demand shock can go either way, plus or minus, but then fiscal policy came. And fiscal policy, of course, created a lot of demand stimulus and put that on steroids, creating more disruptions and more inflation. So we actually show that in a world of supply constraint and supply shock, fiscal policy is going to have a small impact when you look at a fiscal multiplier, and it's going to have small international spillovers. But it's going to be very effective in terms of helping firms not exiting, especially small, medium enterprises, and reallocating employment from sectors that are tight to sectors that are slack. We estimate in our paper, actually, even with the fiscal stimulus, 31% of the global economy was demand constrained, and fiscal policy really helped to reallocate employment to those sectors. Of course, it ended up being inflationary because any demand stimulus in a supply constrained world is going to be inflationary. All right, to conclude, policy lessons for these 6 years of turbulence. The first lesson is that global trade, production, and finance networks are going to be very important to understand the impact of any geopolitical shock, global shock, supply shock on domestic macro outcomes. So it's important for central bankers. Global interdependence and complementarity are things that are going to give us resilience, and they are the things that are going to bind us. Geopolitics can be self-defeating with unintended consequences. Who is gaining, who is losing is going to be a global general equilibrium outcome. Global public goods are always in our self-interest. Tariffs are going to be a very costly way of closing any current account deficit or global imbalances. The second lesson is that monetary policy is still going to be decisive. Even when central banks face asymmetric shocks, even when they face supply shocks, they don't have tools for that, still it is going to be decisive. But stabilization is going to take longer because these cost distortions are going to persist in the system. Why? Very simple. There are N-country monetary policy plus one exchange rate adjustment. You have NJ distortions when the distortions are at the sector level. So here, expectations are going to be important, uncertainty is going to be important, and predictability is going to be a policy asset. So let me leave you with some food for thought. So we have 4 stagflationary shocks in their essence under 4 years: pandemic, 2 wars, and tariffs. Why the resilience? Global economy has been very resilient. Of course, there is good policy, there is the AI boom, there is luck, and they're all correct, but they're only half of the story in my view. There's also this structural feature coming from global interdependence after 4 decades of trade and financial integration. Even we want to take it back right now. This takes us back to the Kindleberger-Hirschman debate I mentioned. Network centrality and granularity can provide macro stabilization at the same time global weaponization for different countries, regardless of you're a large powerful country like US and China, or you're what is now called middle powers. So in an integrated world, every shock is everyone's shocks, and our job as academics and policymakers is to model and measure these edges as carefully as we do with the nodes. So we have to do it, edges are the global linkages and nodes as the countries. And this is now the second part of that John Donne's quote, which of course inspired Ernest Hemingway, and therefore never sent to know for whom the bell tolls, it falls for thee. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Şebnem. That was quite a tour de force. I'm not surprised, but really fantastic. So we have about 10 minutes for questions and comments. Please raise your hands, and I will call on you, and we have the microphones who can go around. Maybe I will start by asking, using the chair's privilege, and asking 2 questions. The first one is I very much like the idea that networks provide resilience. It's not necessarily a given. I mean, we could have networks with, if there's a Leontief part of your network, then that's going to be a major vulnerability. But in general, this is not what I think empirically, this is not what we find. And I think we are in a realm of elasticities that can be low, but not so low that it doesn't provide resilience. But there is the flip side of this, which I think may be a general property, maybe not. I'm not a network expert, so I wouldn't know how to answer. But the flip side of resilience is maybe that it gives you longer lasting shocks, that you may be able to adapt better on impact, but then the shock is going to last or longer. The impulse response is gonna be more drawn out with a higher half-life, if you want. And I think some of your results kind of speak to that. The fact that inflation is going to be taking longer to go away in the network model. I wonder if there isn't a more general property that we should welcome the fact that we have this integrated world. Maybe it gives us resilience, but then we should expect also maybe a long shadow of the shocks. I don't know if you have thoughts on that. The second question is, in this more complex world where we move away from the representative agent, the representative firm, the one sector economy, very clearly the macro instruments of stabilization that we like to think about, whether it's fiscal policy or monetary policy, may be poorly designed for the job. And so the question is, do we need more disaggregated instruments of macroeconomic stabilization? Would there be something that is much more effective if it was able to target and intervene on a particular sector in a particular country in order to provide the support that is needed, maybe at the minimal fiscal cost? But if we could do this kind of targeted interventions, wouldn't that be a better way to do things than monetary policy that gets in all the crevices, or fiscal policy that can be very poorly targeted?
Yes. This is working, right? You can hear me. Okay. You're exactly right. So on the first question, the persistent result exactly comes from that. And that's why I said stabilization burden is now bigger in granular networks. So that kind of networks with kind of, longer supply chain, more linkages, definitely going to give you persistence that lasts longer. In fact, so the results I showed you with the existing network, but we did a lot of counterfactual exercises from the model, looking at this literature, based on firms, multinationals, that argues about different sectors have different shaped networks, like spiders, snakes, right? I mean, like different linkages, different countries. So you're exactly right. The more sectors you have, the more linkages you have, and the more kind of certain products are connected, then you're exactly right. You are creating an environment where, it keeps like this domino effect, right? You are going to have a longer time, so harder job as a policymaker to clean that distortion. You're exactly right. And your second question is, I fully agree. Fiscal policy, if we can target it, of course, the best thing to do here. I mean, in real life, I guess, well, the US definitely didn't do that. And then in Europe, maybe there are some examples in France and Germany, I mean, but not as targeted as you would like, I assume. But that goes without saying. On the fiscal policy, we will definitely be all better off. I mean, in our paper, we did some counterfactuals, as you know, to see that. Now, on the monetary policy, we don't do this because we don't do optimal monetary policy, but there is a closed economy literature that does look at that. So the papers by Elise Rupo, Jennifer Lau, so they try to create another index, another CPI index to target where sectors are weighted by two things: their size, so you target services sector more than manufacturing, and their stickiness. So you target energy sector less, and then again service sector more. So that literature, a closed economy literature, exists, but of course, again, there is no real life application.
Okay. Thank you, Şebnem. I think we have a first hand up, and then the governor. Oh, no. Okay, so please go ahead. Yes.
So I would like to ask, you talk a lot about policies, different type of policies, but this raises also the issue of coordination, international coordination, not only in terms of eliminating policy that try to bring a benefit to you, which is a little bit what we show in the first graph on the optima trade tariff, but also in response to shocks, right? And if you can comment a little bit about what are the implications of your study for policy coordinations at the international level.
Yes, definitely. I mean, this opens up a whole new way of thinking for international policy coordination. And you can think this for any policies, but just for even monetary policy, because that, phi matrix that has everybody's monetary policy directly goes into the propagation. There is, I mean, if you go and now write an optimal version of this paper, to see how much welfare gain I'm going to have, that's definitely open. So we don't do that. But I believe in a smaller model, Veronica Grori, Guido Lorenzoni, and Yvonne Werning, they have a paper now on international coordination, not with full input-output linkages, but with the same idea that because of this relative price impact, maybe it is better to coordinate different monetary policies. You're exactly right.
Danny.
Thank you, Pierre-Olivier. Thank you, Şebnem, for such a wonderful lecture and describing such an impressive body of work. I wanted to try out an idea on you to see how it might be something you've already incorporated in your model. For me and for some others, the essence of geopolitics is that there are different kinds of shocks. There are some shocks that are natural events like COVID and hurricanes and tsunamis. But there are other shocks that come with intentionality. They are shocks that inadvertently or otherwise end up doing some of the rest of us harm while they benefit others. In other words, there's an asymmetry. This is reflected in writings such as, for instance, Adam Posen, who describes how America has transmogrified from being a global provider of insurance to now being an extractor of profit. So these asymmetric shocks, these geopolitical shocks, are not like COVID shocks. I wonder if there's a way within your framework to think about how we model these geopolitical shocks that come with intentionality. Thank you very much.
Yes, so this is why in my last slide I said, we had 4 stagflationary shocks, under 5 years, only one not man-made. That's the pandemic. Everything else is man-made, right? So in our framework, we don't do with the intent to harm. Let me put it this way. You are exactly right. The geopolitics, the models with geopolitics in mind, which is now, broadly referred to geoeconomics, they have this externality, this geopolitical externality in the objective function of the government, right? So the government does something to hurt another government, okay? So we don't have that. So in that sense, we don't have that externality. But what we can definitely put that in. But the point we want to make, that type of work is not global general equilibrium, and generally most of it works with one hegemon. And the idea that, I want to hurt this government, other government, it is in my objective function. I realize there might be some damage to me, but that's okay. I'm taking that in because I'm going to hurt the other guy. So we are saying whatever you are calculating, that is kind of an underestimation of the damage to yourself. That's what we are saying. Why? Because the final result is going to be a global general equilibrium result where you have to take into account all these linkages. And most of that work doesn't do that. That's more like, one country does it, or a kind of a 2-country game theoretic work. So, but yes, a very interesting extension would be exactly to bring that type of a geopolitical externality to this type of a full-fledged global linkages model.
Jan.
Okay. I really enjoyed the talk, very ambitious and timely work. So one specific question about, in the model, the responses of countries to the tariff shock. We know that with the incomplete market, it tends to have this force that when country has a lot of debt, it should repay. So it will run, so country had debt, will run current account surplus. So I wonder how much of the impulse response to tariff shock actually being shaped by this incentive that when I have debt, I have to repay it. We know that in the data that tends to be not the case. Current account tends to be persistent. Like U.S. has a lot of debt, but keep running current account deficit. Thank you.
Yeah, we do it very standard. We close the model. We have portfolio adjustment costs, and then of course, so then once we close the model with portfolio adjustment costs in the quantitative part of the work, we start with the realistic current account deficits and surpluses, and of course, given that situation, we have a capital account wedge. So we have the U.S. Net investment position match exactly as it is using this capital account wedge, right? So then that risk-sharing wedge governs the wealth transfer. And that's the importance of incomplete markets, because if it is complete markets, then everything is going to go to the Europeans, right? So in fact, Caliendo and co-authors of the paper, dynamic trade model, complete markets, the entire wealth is transferred to Europeans because of the complete market assumption. In our case, that's not the case, right? And it is going to depend very much what happens to dollar, to the valuation effect, and in Pierre Olivier's work, what happens to the net debt position with the tariff in the short run and in the long run. And that is all summarized with this risk-sharing wedge, which is going to have both the terms of trade effect and this valuation on the net debt effect. Yeah, but we definitely calibrate to the realistic case.
Thank you. So I think we're coming to the end of our time. So I want to thank all of you for attending this keynote, but especially thank you, Şebnem. So please join me in the final round of applause.